So thank you for being here today. Could you please introduce yourself, including your name, job, area of expertise, and your role in this event?
Yes, my name is Carsten Jahn Hansen. I am an associate professor from Aalborg University in Denmark. I'm also head of director of the Danish Center for Spatial Planning. I'm also the contact point in Denmark concerning ESPON. In my daily work, I work very much with governance and planning issues across sectors and themes and jurisdictions, and between mandatory and non-mandatory planning activities. I'm very interested in how planning activities play out between formal and informal planning settings. I'm also very interested in community development and regional development, and how to make a better use of local and regional actors. Also, I should tell you about how this was set up, this event. It is a joint event between ESPON and ASOP. ASOP is the European Schools of Planning, and we have started up a new thematic group within ESPON called Nordic Planning, and we actually used this to talk with ESPON about how we could put together common activities, and we found that doing an activity here on coastal planning would be a good start. So that was the outset, and I'm part of this Nordic Planning group in ASOP as well.
Could you tell us about how important coastal planning is to maintain harmony and avoid tensions along coastal regions?
Well, I think we all may have an idea that quite a few of us are living along the coast. We can also identify many kinds of interests in coastal development, the usual economic development interests, cities with harbors, tourism, housing, etc. And of course, then we also have other kinds of interest in environmental. In particular, we will want to protect the coast. We have socio-cultural aspects represented as well, with cultural heritage issues. We have used the coast for thousands of years, even, especially in Europe, of tradition and a lot of narratives, and also physically a lot of buildings, monuments, etc. That are along the coast and associated with the coast. So when we look at the coast, we often end up in discussions between protection and use of the coast. And then, of course, there's climate change. Obviously, it becomes increasingly interesting to deal with coastal development because of the rising sea levels, but maybe also in the future as more temperate places to be when inland areas become overheated in the summer. Not just because of tourism then, but because people will actually seek out to the coast because of warmer inlands. So given all this, it becomes very crucial to set up governance and planning settings for handling all these challenges across many interests, obviously.
And what are the specific challenges facing the coastal governance, planning, and development in the north?
Of course, we have many similar challenges as elsewhere. The north is not special in that sense. We do experience many of the same issues that other areas in Southern Europe and outside Europe are experiencing because of density of people and climate change and all that. But climate change may come out a bit differently in the north. In many parts of the north, it's the North Atlantic, North Sea, and Baltic Sea. So we have colder winters. Obviously, the seas are also colder, and you might also find that northern coastal areas are somewhat more sparsely populated if we look at all of Northern Europe compared to Southern Europe. And then it could also be argued that the governance and planning systems are maybe in general different from elsewhere because they are modeled over quite extensive welfare systems. But that has also changed over the years, so it's not so black and white as one might imagine. There are also differences actually between the Nordic countries. That's quite interesting. For instance, between Norway and Denmark, where the integration of regulation of various sectors is quite unique in Denmark, where we have an integration of many sectors on the land side, but the integration with marine spatial planning between marine and land-based planning is not so good. While in Norway, the governance and planning system is tailored so that they integrate the water 1 mile beyond the last piece of cliff above the water line. So they have an integrated marine spatial planning and land use planning. So there are quite some differences between the countries as well.
Could you tell us more about the lessons learned from Nordic regions and the good practices that the Roundtable brought forward?
We had some very interesting presentations, first of all, that provided some input for a roundtable at the end where we had invited national authority representatives to first listen to these presentations and then to give some comments at the end. So I would rather, use the commentaries also along the way, the discussions raised and how it was both referred to in the roundtable, of course, and discussed at the end. And if you look at that and summarize it, we can see that there are definitely tendencies towards decentralization in the Nordic countries, and liberalization, where local units, municipalities in particular, are getting more responsibility for planning and activities locally. Then, with regional planning and national planning being downscaled a bit, it means that the local levels discover the importance of working together because they experience the same kind of issues and problems. So if they want an effect out of their strategies and plans, well, many are currently discovering how important it is to then work across jurisdictions, obviously. So we are in quite an interesting phase where we have many overlapping activities and a lot of fragmentation also, and insufficient integration, with a need for more coordination and better alignment of collaboration. But we also see some of these cross-border governance and planning spaces, new planning spaces occurring across these jurisdictions, which then become tailored better to what is actually at stake locally and regionally. It was also mentioned how cross-fertilization between sectors and jurisdictions are needed, how we can actually learn from each other and be more focused on this process of mutual learning. And in that, issues of, for instance, building trust in such new settings, if you cross borders and jurisdictions and sectors, etc., it's a new setup with a mixture of interests, and it becomes really important to build trust relations between the actors, both based on values, but also on the knowledge they may have, each of them. You can ask yourself what is actually being trusted here. Is it the personal relation, or is it because you know something, or is it the institution, etc. So it's issues like that you have to look into. So basically, there are now so many interests at stake and so many stakeholders at play that you can say that traditional comprehensive planning becomes almost impossible, because you cannot have an overview of all this. So you must tailor governance and planning to new settings where you find something that is where you have an overview at least. So what we also found or could see through the presentations, and what was also noted by the roundtable participants here, were that there's also a lack of participation by locals or actors who are not usually part of the development process. And this is a bit surprising, because we have been talking about participation for 40, 50 years, and we have understood this for long, and there are so many benefits from it. It gives you better knowledge, it activates a wider amount of resources, and that's important in a situation where most public authorities do not have the resources they may have had earlier to help development along. So they are interested, of course, in generating or activating local resources. And you could also look this in terms of culture, actually. It builds on the culture of each place, and in two ways, actually, which is interesting. It then becomes something where you actually respect the place identity, and also the culture of interaction, the culture of governance and planning itself, where that there might be a local tradition on how to successfully work between people that you can build on. So why not use it? And etc. I mean, those are all the good reasons. And then, of course, all the barriers are, for instance, that it is quite a thing to facilitate and to handle. For instance, if you are a planner in a municipality or at higher levels, to organize all this, it takes a lot of coordination skill. And that's probably why we don't see as much of it as we want to. And if I look at the conclusions here, also from the roundtable, they mentioned a need for updated knowledge concerning both the conflicts themselves between interests, but also how to work them out in new transdisciplinary settings across jurisdictions. They also actually pointed to case studies as essential, because in case studies you can discuss and show all these links between interests, both horizontally but also vertically between levels of government. They also pointed to the importance of strategy building, focus on strategy building and leadership, and cooperation based on this cross-fertilization perspective that was also presented early in the day. One actor also mentioned the development, if you look at the land use situation of new zoning, new types of zoning that combines earlier types of zoning and are more flexible and adaptable, etc. That might also be an instrument here.
What is your opinion on these findings, and what could be expanded on?
I think, and this is not just my opinion, but also an attempt to refer to studies. I think there's a tendency, for instance, if we look at the context here of coasts and development, that, for instance, tourism has been debated for decades, and the challenges of that, what happens in particular if you get what the locals consider to be too much tourism in a place, and the locals might not feel local anymore. This tells us that we should become better at integrating tourism activities with community development. So instead of separating tourism from local communities, we should probably try to look into how to create a respect of these local areas. Then I would say that there's definitely a need for a more place-sensitive agenda, one that combines the best of each place, as we've already talked about, the local knowledge, etc., and local decision-making culture, etc. But one that also combines the knowledge from outside, from larger institutions, from the national level, etc. It's communication here between different kinds of knowledges, both situated, specific, but also those with a knowledge of the grander perspective that we must cater for sure. Yeah, and then we need to create better connections here between these non-mandatory strategy building and planning activities with the formal systems, as simple as that, because we now see so many new kinds of governance and planning activities emerging that perhaps we should also take a look at our formal systems and how they integrate those activities better. But the question is then, do we want to learn from that in our planning systems? That's the issue. So we need to tailor participatory strategies and settings along those lines and adapt it to such circumstances for sure. And it also means that co-creation, which we've talked about also for many years now already, well, we can see it's not just for fun. It is something that is actually usable and can generate a greater attention to local place identity on the one hand, development of that, but also where we can use the best of the governance approaches and collaboration approaches locally, and sort of match that with larger systems here. So yes, that is pretty much my opinion on that.
Did this roundtable provide some answers to the core questions in search of advice for policymakers and planners, which were how to evolve coastal governance and planning in the future, how to better include local communities, and how can new governments and planning spaces help to achieve a more inclusive and sustainable coastal development?
I think what we did was that we, in particular, identified relevant and meaningful parameters for all that, which is really important. And given that the answer to those kind of questions here will always be something where it needs to be adapted to the situation and the place, etc. It also means that you cannot really create one model here that fits all places. What you can do is to create an understanding of relevant parameters, and then based on that you can tailor your own model for each place. That's what you can do. And I think we had a good discussion throughout the event that took us in that direction too.
And where can we find out more?
Many places. You can, first of all, you can look through all the presentations here. It comes from different settings, as you can see. Obviously, the ESPON projects, there's a lot to gain from that. And this is not just the current round of projects. If you go back, there are earlier rounds of ESPON projects that has generated knowledge that you can still find applicable for present-day issues, for sure. You can also take a look at this ASOP Nordic planning group and the activities of that. And then in terms of coastal issues, we have had, for instance, just at our university, a Horizon 2020 project called Pericles, in which we've looked at cultural heritage in coastal areas in many places in Europe. And I know that there are many other projects with attention to that also in the Horizon program. So various kinds of European programs, but also in ASOP settings, and yeah, take a look at the researchers working with this in the event, and you can easily find a lot of information